welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and this is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literature, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. Today, we are pulling on a string that I left hanging last episode. That is a specific section of the United Empire Loyalists known as Black Loyalists. What a coincidence that I'm doing this episode during Black History Month. Almost like it was planned this way. Who knows? I will be examining this specifically through the use of Lawrence Hill's 2007 novel, The Book of Negroes. For some international listeners, you might have seen the book published as Someone Knows My Name. This is the story of a young African girl who is forced into slavery, brought to America, and later to Nova Scotia as a Black Loyalist. As one might expect, by extension, I'm going to be talking about slavery in the British Empire, in Canada, and, of course, the aftermath and impact of Black Loyalists, and eventual emancipation. I do want to warn listeners, though, before we start, that this episode is naturally going to contain some sensitive topics given its central theme, so please be warned. Before we get started, I want to plug a project that I think might interest some of my listeners. I wrote an essay for Panel by Panel, which is a comics criticism digital magazine about Canadian comics and what they tell us about the time they were published in. A bit like this show, but in text format. It will soon be available in print and later in digital format, so you can follow me on Twitter at CanLitHistory or my publisher at PanelxPanel for updates. I know the Kickstarter is soon going to launch for that one, so keep up to date if you want to get your hands on it through there. And you can stick around to the end of the show if you want to know more about it in general. Alright, at the top of the episode, I mentioned that we were going to concentrate on a single book for this episode. For those of you who haven't read it, I'm going to start with a quick summary before going into the historical context and inspiration as I usually do, making parallels with the text along the way. I guess that the best place to start here is with a reminder that the Book of Negroes is a work of fiction based on a series of historical events. Lawrence Hill, the author, does pull from all types of historical accounts in order to form an accurate and cohesive story through the eyes of a fictional character. So while this is not a primary source like the exploration texts from a few weeks back, or even to some extent the poetry that we saw over the last two episodes, Lawrence Hill's 2007 novel is still a great way of approaching a very dark past in a way that isn't as dry as simply reading the history of the actual Book of Negroes, which we'll get into. This actually segues nicely into the next idea I want to hit on now and develop later. The title might seem incredibly difficult for modern readers. That is namely why some publishers in different countries outside of Canada chose to release the novel under a different name. The reason for the title choice, as Lawrence Hill intended it, is rooted in the fact that there was a text named The Book of Negroes that did exist as a type of ledger around the time where the story we are covering today takes place. I'll get into the details further on, but keep that in mind. The alternate title of Someone Knows My Name still works thematically for the story, but in my opinion, it doesn't hit as hard as the original. To a degree, I understand why certain publishers would be uneasy and want to change the name, but then again, isn't that kind of the point of the title? It's meant to cause anxiety and be a part of the past that cannot be ignored. And I know Hill himself has talked about it, saying that publishing it in Canada as the Book of Negroes wouldn't have the same connotation as publishing it, for example, in the United States with the same name. If you use the term Negro in Canada, you might sound more like someone from another era who hasn't quite gotten with the program yet. Whereas in the States, it's very much, and rightfully so, it's very much associated with just being a racist. So anyway, I digress. Just know that If you're interested in this book after this episode, you might want to look for it under a different alphabetical section of the bookstore. So getting on with it, let's talk briefly about the story of the Book of Negroes. I will be interjecting with further details as we touch upon different subjects, but for now let's start with an abstract. At its core, the novel is about slavery and the right to be human, especially through the attribution and identification of a name. Our protagonist is named Aminata, a young Muslim girl from within the African continent, who is taken into slavery by Europeans and shipped off to the colonies in the New World, losing her family and identity in the process. From there, Aminata encounters a series of people who inform and help her navigate this new life. A few years into her slavery, the American Revolution happens, and with the help of the contacts she made through the years, Aminata manages to secure her freedom and exit away from the burgeoning republic as she heads to Nova Scotia as a Black Loyalist. While being theoretically free, the former slave community she finds herself in still faces hardships, and many of them attempt to return back home to Africa. Unfortunately, what will become known as Sierra Leone is far from being everything that it is hyped up to be, and Aminata ends up in England, where her experiences as a former slave and her strong character get her involved in the abolitionist movement that was taking place in Britain and its empire at the time. Okay, I know that was a boatload of information. This Cliff's Notes style summary did allow me to cover the major points that I want to hit on this episode through the novel, and that is slavery in the British Empire, Black Loyalists, Nova Scotia and continued racism, briefly Sierra Leone, which is where the Black Loyalists or some Black Loyalists went to in Africa, and the end of slavery in the British Empire and its impact on Canada. I think that we can do this in a single episode, but we'll have to get cracking, and if not, well, it'll be a two-parter. We'll just deal with it. Slavery as a concept and history is obviously too broad to cover in one part of a single podcast, but I will still do my best to establish the groundwork because it is such an important part of the book we are examining and the foundation of the European empires that ruled the world until not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. While we will be focusing mostly on British and American slavery here, I must note, just to be safe, that they were not the only ones doing this. This is a widespread thing in the European empires at the time we are now putting under a lens. While there are many overlaps, there are some differences in the way that history of slavery played out in the British Empire and Canada. If we focus on Canada, as we ought to do in this case, given the nature of the podcast, there is evidence of slavery prior to European arrival. The natives along the northwest coast of North America did indeed also have slaves, often ones that had been captured in war, but not always. And slaves were central to the hunting and fishing cultures of these northwest peoples, and were used as items of exchange and labor, for example. With the arrival of the French and later of the British, slavery continued to be central, but was essentially expanded upon. Taking black people from the coast of Africa, the French brought slaves over to their North American colonies as early as 1608. There is little evidence at this point that their method of using and acquiring slaves was different from the British, who were still mostly confined to the 13 colonies. When the French regime came to a close in North America in 1759, there was an estimated 3,600 slaves, about 30% of whom were of African descent, in New France. The majority of them were actually from various indigenous populations and were generically known as the Panis, P-A-N-I-S. When the British took over in the 18th century, Slaves came along with them, once again being pulled from Africa. Despite Canada and the soon-to-be United States still occupying the same place within the British Empire, there are differences that would be marked between slavery in the two areas. As historian Kenneth Donovan puts it in the Oxford Companion to Canadian History, throughout the northern colonies, unlike the plantation economies of the South, living conditions mitigated the harshest aspects of slavery. Employed on farms throughout the countryside and as domestic servants in towns, slaves lived in close proximity to whites. Owning only one or two slaves, most slaveholders remained confident of their hegemony, and hence slaves were allowed a certain degree of autonomy. Slaves in Canada represented less than 1% of the population. Thus, Canada was a society with slaves, not a slave society. Now, the relation to the Book of Negroes begins with the 13 colonies, not Canada just yet. Also, I want to note that I will be covering the book in chronological order of the events in their proper time, not as they are being recounted, because it flops back and forth to various eras, and that would make for a very confusing podcast. The first chronological event in the novel is our protagonist Aminata being captured from her village by European slave traders. In this part of the novel, Hill places a lot of emphasis on the immediate denigration of slaves by removing them from their families, having them walk for months and months, and altering their names to fit a more pronounceable form for English speakers. This last point is especially true when Aminata and the slaves get sent to America, where Aminata, being specifically sent to South Carolina, has her name changed to Mina D by her owners. This really kicks off the whole quest for an identity that is proper to herself that will define the rest of the novel. Very quickly in the novel, Aminata is taught how to read, speak, and write in English. This is another aspect that must be mentioned when it comes to slavery. The loss of cultural identity in favor of that of the colonizer, in this case, the British. Where Aminata is a Muslim from West Africa, she is not encouraged, sometimes violently so, to keep that aspect of her past. She no longer has an identity beyond what the British told her to have. And even in learning to speak and write in English, that is taught to her by slaves or compassionate owners. In fact, Aminata's whole experience in America is where we can relate it back to the slave experience at its worst. It is during this time that she is treated like a piece of property that is done with as the owner wills. She is raped by a plantation owner. She can never publicly express the love she has for her partner. The work she is put through is often unbearable, and her own child is taken away from her. Even when she is reunited with her partner, it only brings more bad news when she discovers that her current owner, with whom she had had an increasingly better relationship, was responsible for the sale of her child. It is not long after this revelation in the novel that we will arrive at a point in time where the Black Loyalists become relevant. In the Book of Negroes, Aminata is in New York with her then current owner, Lindo, when the American Revolution breaks out. At this time, as she had proven herself through good behavior time and again, and as a useful, she was able, with Lindo's support, before their falling out, to work on his bookkeeping, as well as work as a teacher and midwife for other Black people in the area. These abilities come in handy when she is able to help British soldiers and officers in their own lives. Such a proof of loyalty towards the British during the war is the type of action that allowed Black slaves to make it onto the real-life Book of Negroes. Having her name on this register guaranteed Aminata's exit from America through the British ships. There are some complications that involve her getting recaptured and temporarily losing her husband again, but in the end, she does make it to the British colony of Nova Scotia, where she gets to live as a free woman, along with the other loyal black settlers in what is known as Birchtown. It is there that she realizes that life was not exactly as it had been promised to the free slaves, with land being poorer than expected, and the former slaves still facing segregating policies and racism from the white Nova Scotians. I'll stop the recap of the novel here for now, and let's see how the Black Loyalist experience played out in its true context. Just as with Aminata, the Black Loyalists were a section of the Loyalists we covered last episode. Just as with the Loyalists, the British promised compensation to the slaves who proved their loyalty, in this case with land grants and, more importantly, freedom, along with the equality to whites in the view of the British administration. Loyalty was proven in many ways as long as it was done in service of the British Crown. As such, Black Loyalists became soldiers in their own corps within the British Empire. They became spies and laborers in the hope that a British victory over the rebels would allow them to live freely in what many now considered to be their home, America. The British victory over American rebels obviously did not come, and in defeat, about 3,500 Black Loyalists were evacuated from America. Now, in order for Black people to be considered eligible to depart from America as Loyalists and to receive the compensations of freedom and land, you had to be on the logbook that serves as the title of the novel. Without their name there, Black people would not be allowed onto the departing ships and would have most likely been assumed to be slaves trying to use this opportunity to escape their captivity. Much like Aminata, who ends up in the Birchtown community, which was segregated from the main town of Shelburne, many separate communities were formed in Nova Scotia as more and more former slaves arrived. These places became centers of Black culture in early Canada, with distinct churches and schools helping form the basis of it. Birchtown was historically actually the largest of such communities, with over 1,500 people establishing themselves there. Now, as you might expect, problems did not end as soon as the Black Loyalists arrived here in Canada. The promise of equality was tainted by a systematic racism and segregation that existed in the almost exclusively British administration and communities. What's more, the lands that were offered to the Black Loyalists were barely enough for them and their families to live off, let alone survive adequately. Finally, there is necessarily an issue caused by the fact that slavery was still not formally abolished in the British Empire when the Loyalists arrived, causing rifts within those who were free and those who weren't, as well as reinforce the European mentality that not all Black people should or could be free. This means that while these Black Loyalists community were nominally free, there was a whole slew of issues that allowed their mistreatment to persist. I hate saying that the situation the Black Loyalists ended up in was better than the alternative at the time, which is unfortunately true, but that doesn't stop the fact that there was still a lot of improvement to be had in Nova Scotia and the British Empire. This is what will lead us to the last part of the show, with the aftermath of the American Revolution and the abolishment of slavery. Coming back to the novel for a while, the latter part of the story focuses on Aminata's attempt to go back to her home village of Bayo in Africa, and the eventual help she gives to the British abolitionist movement. Like many in the new settlements, and in not too dissimilar fashion as many white loyalists who returned to America after the revolution ended, Aminata and her compatriots were unhappy with the new lives in Nova Scotia. With the help of certain British officials, they managed to convince the Crown to let them leave the North American colony and head to a British colony in Africa in what is now known as Sierra Leone, where they would live in Freetown as essentially autonomous peoples in Africa who would still nominally be under British rule. Aminata's goal is to head there and hopefully return to her village from that point, not fully understanding where it is in relation to Freetown or just how big Africa is. It's all well and fine for her to see a map, but the concept of space is not really one that she had understood as much as the Europeans who had been traveling, for example, back and forth between the continents. Perhaps unsurprisingly, once Aminata got to Freetown, the land and survival problem becomes an issue once more, just as it had in Nova Scotia. She realizes that she will never be able to return home, as Africa is not a place that she recognizes beyond the borders and memories of her village. And even if she does make it back to her hometown, it's never going to be quite the same after all she's been through. You can't forget the past and just move on without taking it into consideration. So accepting that she can never fully recapture what she lost, Aminata chooses to help those of her peers who are still enslaved and decides to go to Britain with the aid of the man who helped bring her to Freetown, where, as a spokesperson against slavery, she joins the abolitionist movement that was gaining more and more ground by the end of the 18th and 19th century. So how does this translate to reality? Once again, quite well, actually, with the obvious exception that we are seeing this through the eyes of a single fictional person. The exodus, if you will, of about half the Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia did indeed take place at the end of the 18th century, about 10 years after the end of the American Revolution. In light of the complaints that I enumerated about Nova Scotia earlier, a certain Thomas Peters, who was a former sergeant from the Black Pioneer Corps, initiated a complaint addressed to King George III. This complaint was supported and given traction by the aforementioned abolitionists in Great Britain, most of whom argued for the removal of slavery with a religious angle, claiming that it went against the will of God and the Christian doctrine of equality and justice. When this movement really began growing in the 18th century, although there were always some that had argued against slavery from the get-go, the religious argument was probably the most effective way to convince slave owners of their wrongdoing. The Crown's response to this demand for better living conditions and for the upholding of promises is where the offer to move to Sierra Leone comes from. All in all, approximately 1,200 Black Loyalists left from Halifax in 1792. These mass departures were not simply due to the poor living conditions, but to the bonds and loyalties that had been formed as a result of those conditions. Children were often raised communally, and women found themselves having to work as well in order to provide for their families. These situations often led to very tightly knit groups being formed out of the hardships of labor and life. And so as such, when one person would decide to leave, so would many others who wanted to stay with that same community. The Black Loyalists who did decide to leave left through what is called the Sierra Leone Company. This was similar to something like the Hudson's Bay Company, in that it was a private enterprise that was essentially subcontracted by the British government to enact a certain task. In this case, transport former slaves to West Africa and establish a settlement there that is specifically for them. These settlers would remain in the area of Freetown and establish the basis for the modern nation of Sierra Leone, with a culture that fuses a British Western culture with their own traditions. An example of this is that, according to University of Waterloo professor James Walker, the descendants of these initial Freetown settlers still identify themselves as Nova Scotians. As for the abolishment of slavery, the process goes beyond the purview of the novel. There were many thousands of slaves in Canada by the time it was done away with in the 19th century. About 34% of the Black immigrants that came from America into Canada were slaves, most of whom ironically came with the United Empire Loyalists, who had not set them free when arriving in the Maritimes. By the end of the 18th century, there were hundreds of slaves, each in Quebec, Ontario, as well as Cape Breton. With the help of the abolitionist movement in Britain, these slaves slowly but surely gained more and more freedom. At first, the legislations set by the British government were mostly a way to stop the further development of slavery. In 1803, the slave trade was officially abolished in the British Empire, which meant that the Atlantic slave trade would take a major hit in terms of its international reach, since one of its biggest players would stop participating. It was still legal to own a slave at that point, though. The intent behind such a long transition period was in part to allow slave owners and slave-using industries to transition to a business model that did not require the utilization of free labor. Furthermore, the government did not want to alienate its slave-owning electoral base by immediately removing what that base considered to be its property. It sounds absolutely horrible to say as much, but there was a political game at play in the abolition of slavery, and it unfortunately did not include its immediate removal from the British Empire. After the series of measures, both legislative and judicial, it would finally be in 1833 that the ownership of slaves was abolished for good in the British Empire. While I want to touch upon this specific point in a later episode, the freedom that was given to Black people in Canada through the British Crown's decision, while definitely not perfect and still wrought with problems of continued racism, did give hope to certain populations such as African Americans in the United States who would start coming into Canada through what is commonly known as the Underground Railroad starting in 1830. With approximately 40,000 freed slaves arriving in the Great White North before the end of the Civil War. Now, the Underground Railroad itself could be the subject of its own historical analysis. We often tend to look at it rather romantically here, but we're going to get into that. We don't have time to develop it that much in this case, but it is something to take into consideration. All right, so we covered a lot in this episode, and as always, there is bound to be some stuff that I skipped over or had to cut for time. My goal here was to present to you a fascinating book by Lawrence Hill, what I consider a veritable modern classic, and the way it allows us to be introduced to a part of Canada's history that is often mentioned but never really developed in the popular and common discourse. The Book of Negroes, as a novel and a historical document, provides us with insights into the displacement of Black communities in North America and is an inevitable point to touch upon in the development of the Black identity in Canada. The often mythologized and nostalgic version of our past here in Canada often taints the admission that we too participated in slavery and that not all was rosy and sweet when Loyalists and Black Loyalists left the United States to come here. The history of racism in Canada, while different in certain aspects to its southern neighbor, is nevertheless filled with unspoken and unadmitted stories of forced labor, humiliation, dehumanization, and remodeled identity. But just because we must come to terms with this past, it does not mean that we cannot learn from it. On the contrary, this is exactly the type of thing that we must learn from. Not just the fun books and poems that I present, but the sad ones, and the ones that bring to light a less savory past. Using the Book of Negroes, we are given a chance to remember the past that haunts us and use it to build a better and stronger future with the help of the communities that are an integral and historical part of this country. These are communities that, like many others, have stories to tell that must be added to the fabric of Canadian history and culture that is being woven day in and day out by peoples that have gone through many trials to be able to come to this point in time. The slavery of the British and the European empires may be behind us, but their ghosts remain to remind us that in the end, we're all humans that deserve equal treatment, and not just here in Canada, but everywhere on the planet. With that being said, that should just about do it for this week. I know that was a bit of a long-winded ending, but I believe it was a valuable one and one that I had to get out there. I want to thank everyone for listening, and one last time, I'm going to plug two things actually in this outro. First of all, I'm going to plug again the essay that I wrote for Panel by Panel, which you can check out through my Twitter at CanLitHistory or Panel by Panel's Twitter page, which is PanelxPanel. Pretty soon the Kickstarter is going to be up for that. So if you're interested in finding out about Canada's history of comic books and how it tells us about this nation's history, check it out. And there's a bunch of others that are also equally interesting if you're interested in the comics field beyond Canada. So mine talks about Superman, it talks about the early Victorian comics in Punch, it talks about Captain Canuck, all kinds of things. Also, I set up a Ko-fi page, which is kind of my way of financing this independent podcast. I haven't set up a Patreon yet, which seems to be the more popular choice because I don't yet have time to set up these rewards more than anything else. And Ko-fi allows you to just chip in $1 without any recurring payment if you don't feel like it. If you want to give in just a one-time thing, a donation, that's great. It allows this show to keep going and so forth. If you don't want to do that, though, that's totally okay. I'm still going to do the show. It's just a little kickback to say thank you, I guess. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter, as I said, and all the links that I mentioned or plugs that I mentioned are in the description. You can always reach out to me through any of those means. I will be happy to answer. And finally, if you would consider leaving a review, even if there are no comments, it would be very appreciated. It does help. And for now, I'll say see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.